This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought, and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I am Dalia Shenlin. We are broadcasting from London.
And I'm Gilad Halpern. Our guest today is Linda Grant. She's a prize-winning and prolific author who has written 7 novels and 4 works of non-fiction, including The People on the Street from 2006, a non-fiction book of observations about life in Israel. But today we'll be talking about her latest novel. It's called The Dark Circle. It was published by Virgo in 2017. It was shortlisted for the Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction. So we'd like to welcome you to the show, Linda Grant.
Thank you very much.
Your book tells the story of 2 young Jewish adults, twins, in London in the late 40s, early 50s, who were sent to a sanatorium for TB. It's a very specific sort of situation. Why did you choose to place the story in this specific place and time?
Well, it's a bit of getting an idea for a novel is it has quite a long tail to it. And when I was a child, the government sent out these mobile X-ray units into all the cities to X-ray people for TB because they had a cure for it, right? So they thought that if they could screen for it, then they could cure it and they could eradicate it, which is pretty much what happened. And I remember seeing these vans going past and asking my mother what they were and being very excited and obviously wanting to be X-rayed myself. And one of my cousins was X-rayed and had TB and was sent away and was cured. So that had sort of been in my memory. And then as sort of something I was curious about, it's the only way I can describe it. And then about 3 years ago, I received a letter from an elderly woman living locally to me who was trying to write a memoir about her late husband who had been a union president. And she sent me these pages. And in the beginning, she said, when he started his career, I was in a TB sanatorium. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. So I went to talk to her just to find out more. And she explained to me she'd been diagnosed with TB when she was 19 years old and sent off to this sanatorium at the time in which the cure had been discovered in America. But the British government didn't have the money to buy it. And as a matter of hanging on, seeing how long, if you could hang on long enough to be cured. So that was the first part of it. And I thought, that's quite interesting. And then the other thing she told me was that it was the first year of the National Health Service. So instead of being sent off to, a clinic in Switzerland, in Davos, to breathe fresh air in the mountains with rich people, these private sanatoria were being opened up to people of all classes who were all held together in this kind of claustrophobic, enclosed environment, waiting for this cure to arrive. And I thought, that's a novel. That I see as a novel.
It's interesting you talk about this enclosure, like they're enclosed together. But on the other hand, there's sort of an ambiguity because they're living in London that is rather living through a period of deprivation after the war, through austerity. The shadow of the Holocaust isn't far behind. And they come to this institution where in some ways they have a protected environment, stability, and adventures of meeting people.
And good food as well.
Good food, right. I mean, it's an interesting contrast.
Well, yeah, that's right. So they're going, but what's happening is that they're going into a static situation in which, their lives are very, very comfortable. They don't have to work. They just rest all day. As you say, they come into contact with very different people. And in the meantime, life is moving on. And I just want to say that this building that we're sitting in, my flat, was built in 1950. And this road that we're on, there were occasional bombs dropped because the railway line along there is the main railway line to King's Cross. And that was one of the main targets for the Luftwaffe, and they would drop stray bombs along the street. So when I was writing this, I was writing it in a building which was being built in this time, which is why I made the uncle of the twins a property developer who is actually building this block of flats.
Well, you've actually raised the next question that I was going to ask, which was, the writing really throws the reader into a completely different world, right? Historical, it's way far back in history, different time, different mood. It's a period piece in a way. I was going to ask how you put yourself into that period piece. Now we have a partial answer, but how do you get at all the tiny details and the color that makes it feel so realistic?
Well, I did some medical research. I researched sort of, about tuberculosis and about the drug streptomycin, which cured them. I mean, that stuff had to be accurate. But you know what I did? I went and looked at YouTube videos.
The guilty pleasure that we all want to deny. You found a good use for it.
Yeah. If you just type in a few words, you could see all kinds of videos. At the beginning of the book, there is a fascist rally in Trafalgar Square, and it's based on something I just found, I found on YouTube. And so a lot of the time, you could just kind of go and look at photographs or videos of what was happening at the time and use that.
Did that include the herring to the face attack on the fascist?
No, I made that up.
No, but also I think the fact that your protagonists are Jewish says a lot. I mean, in the beginning of this conversation, you talked about your memories and experiences as a child. And how much of your story, of your characters, are based on your own experiences and people that you actually knew?
They're not based on anybody that I actually knew, and they're not based on my own experiences. I mean, people will always say to me, things like, is it autobiographical? And I say, yes, of course. It's based on my experiences going to Palestine in 1946, yes, before I was even born. When I was thinking, who am I going to put in this environment? I'm going to collide all these different types of characters. And I had a very middle-class, young female graduate who from Oxford University, and then I thought, who am I going to put with them? And you definitely need someone working class, and I'm more familiar with poor Jews than I am with poor non-Jews, let's put it that way. And I'm not going to say working class Jewish life, because they're not really working class exactly. They're immigrants, right? That's the point. I mean, they're born in England, but they come from a Jewish immigrant background, which would have been very alien to most of the people that they would have met. The anti-Semitism would still be rife. The Holocaust of, very recent memory would still not really have been integrated into people's thinking. There was still plenty of anti-Semitism about. So I wanted to bring them in, partly because they're going to Sanatorium outside a village in the middle of Kent, right? And these are city people, these are ghetto people, these are slum people, and they're going to an environment which they have no understanding of. And so probably my favourite scene in the book is when Lenny, in his striped zoot suit, goes for a walk and accidentally strays into the woods and really does not know how to deal with this sort of Sylvan situation.
And there is a line that I particularly like, that their experiences during the war made them hate nature.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, they're like scrappy alley cats out of their natural habitat.
That's right. They're not, so they've been evacuated to Wales during the war and absolutely hated it and desperate to come back. And then they're thrown into this very, very enclosed environment.
And how does the Jewishness play into their experiences in the sanatorium?
I think, as I said, the thing about all of these people who are in the sanatorium is they are being held in one spot while life is moving on. These are two very young people. They're, 18, 19 years old, and life lies ahead of them. And they should be kind of forging on into the future, away from this kind of world of, the war, of darkness. They should be, inventing the next part of their lives. And the thing about their Jewishness is that they don't trust authority. They don't have the English deference to authority. And in the relationship between Miriam and the young graduates that she's sharing with, she's grown up in that sort of anti-Semitic, English middle-class family where the doctors could be your father or your uncle, and so you're deferential to them. And this is something that they bring both from London and from their Jewishness. They are not deferential, but also they're not deferential to anything. They're not deferential to the law. One of the things that there is a mention of what was until very recently a real shop called Bluston's in Kentish Town, which its main clientele consisted of 90-year-old women. You know, I'm serious. That's not an exaggeration. It's not hyperbole. Most of its customers were 90, and they wanted the kinds of clothes that, 90-year-old women wore. But that shop was started in the 1930s, and so Miriam is dressed in the most vulgar, Jewish, ostentatious way.
There's some very elaborate descriptions of the color of her dresses, and her lipstick.
Yes, that's right. So she brings this kind of breath of vitality, and that's really based on my aunts, my mother's friends, who believed in, you don't go out the house without your lipstick on. They always wore heels. They never wore trousers. They always wore too much mascara. These were women who kind of faced life down by putting on, a good appearance.
Which is interesting considering that there's a shadow of death that hangs over the entire book, both in the recent past and in the very immediate potential future of all the people there.
Well, all the people are plagued by the presence of death. So you have a number of, and this Margaret, who I interviewed, explained to me, there were a lot of ex-army officers who had survived the war but had been stricken with TB. And one has to remember, most people didn't know, people would spend years in these sanatoriums. So they'd be invalided out of the army in 1943, 1944, and still be there in 1950. These young men who were just kind of wasting away and for whom death had been, an ever-present excitement and now was just, a slow kind of chronic, movement to the grave. So there is them. There's another character who is a non-Jewish concentration camp survivor, a survivor from Ravensbrück, who has been taken prison because she's lesbian, and there's that shadow of death as well. So, yes, death is all around them and people are dying.
Yet it's constantly humorous, full of humorous observations, even though the situation itself, as you said, is pretty dire. Yeah. And I think that in a way, the title, Dark Circles, is misleading in a way.
Oh, okay. Well, can we talk about some of those funny situations, like offering the patients Guinness along with their milk? Or
well, that's real.
The pony with the zebra being a pony with a statement. I mean, there's a lot of humor in the book. Why so much humor? What's the role of it?
When I was writing it, I read a novel which was published in 1962. It was the only novel the guy ever wrote. His name was Ellis. And he was one of those officers who had been stricken with TB, and he had actually gone to Switzerland. He'd gone to Davos. And the novel is called The Rack. And it's the most depressing novel I have ever read in my life. It was a real struggle to finish it. And I read Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, which is, of course, the great TB. And it's actually a very funny novel. I mean, there's some extraordinary humour in it. And I realised if you're going to write about something so incredibly depressing, you've got to make it funny. And in every situation where people are in those kinds of enclosed environments, there's always what we call in England gallows humour or black humour. You can't survive it without jokes, without humour. And I knew that there was a certain point, I remember just sitting here thinking, it's just getting too depressing. I need to liven things up. And this is when I decided that I would introduce a new character, in the form of this American merchant seaman, Arthur Persky, who brings his very early rock and roll records and brings sex into the sanatorium. And so I didn't want to keep the reader in a state of depression for the entire novel.
Right. We found the book very associative. It raised lots of other references for us. And so we were having a little argument over which is a potential influence or not exactly comparison, but I'd like to hear your response about. I thought about Solzhenitsyn's Cancer Ward, which is a very different kind of novel because, just a completely different premise. But Gilad thought about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
That's the one.
Oh, well, he's got it right. But explain to us, I thought it was so different actually,
No.
from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But tell us where you locate this.
One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was absolutely the novel that I was thinking of. I mean, I'd started off by thinking about Philip Roth's Nemesis, which is, of course, about...
At least I didn't raise Philip Roth this time.
Yeah, I was going to say enter Dahlia's habitual Philip Roth reference. Yeah.
All roads lead back to Roth.
Yeah, no, I had read Roth's Nemesis, and I thought that's really remarkable which is why when I had remembered seeing the vans, I was thinking maybe there's something there, another forgotten disease. But One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, yes, because what happens in that novel is disorder is brought in, disorder and defiance, and what this novel for me is about defiance, about bringing down the established order, because you've got this sanatorium which is run on the principles of the rest cure, which was all they had, and a few kind of fairly useless surgical procedures. But the idea of the way of the patient, where the patient must be patient, must exercise patience, and the law is laid down by the medical director. And what is about to happen to him is his entire life's work is going to be junked. It's going to be thrown away by the arrival of what was effectively an antibiotic. So antibiotics just completely transform medicine. And the people in the sanatorium, particularly the young Jews, the merchant seamen, are the ones who are going to say, no, we're rejecting this. We're just rejecting this old order. And of course, that is what was going on outside the sanatorium, because all kinds of things were coming into being. So then the NHS had just started. Up on the hill behind here, the BBC was broadcasting from Alexandra Palace. First television broadcasts were going out. All kinds of things were happening. And all of these people are trapped and cut off and not allowed to take part in them. So the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was the model that was in my mind, not to try to write, another character like that, but to take the idea that you can wake people up out of their compliance.
I just think in a way yours is more complex, if I may say so. Really, because One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the whole, it's the staff against the inmates, and, a very clearly divided clash of who's trying to abuse whom here. And, this is much more complex. You have staff who are very complex figures. The doctor, the lonely doctor, and they're sympathetic. And so you're saying it's a similar model, but much more metaphorical.
Yes, I think so, yeah.
Did you also have illness as a metaphor in mind, Susan?
No, I didn't actually. I try when I'm writing something not to read too much, except just for very basic fact-checking research. I mean, if you're going to write about TB, you've got to get the facts right. You really do. You can't say there was no cure when there was a cure. But no, I don't especially like to keep... I mean, I just prefer it to come from the realm of the imagination.
It's a period in history that is long gone now. I mean, TB is eradicated, and these people have, we're 2-3 generations down the line. Do you think that it's like today's Britain is very much different from the one that you describe in your book, or there are really parallels that are still relevant today?
Today's Britain is in such a complex, terrible mess that...
somehow we always get to that other insight with our British guests.
we're in... I mean, I think it's very different in so many ways because, we have the most colossal levels of, affluence for so many people. But on the other hand, what they had in 1949 rather, was a very, very clear view of the future. They knew exactly where they were going. They were moving away from the wartime period. They were laying down, the welfare state, the National Health Service. They were building. They were creating. And people had a sense of purpose and a huge sense of hope. There were great social transformations for the good were taking place. Now what we're in is a period of disintegration, I think that's the best word for it, with no government able to exercise any control over the future of where we're going, the internal contradictions between each of the major parties, leaving Europe. I mean, something that a friend of mine who's in her 80s said, that when he first heard of the birth of the common market, the European Union, he said, "Thank God there won't be any more wars." And it is now utterly forgotten that one of the purposes of the European Union was to bring peace to Europe. And now, 1948, 49, 50, first immigration arriving from the Caribbean. Now we're trying to get rid of immigrants. So I think that it was a time of way greater austerity and personal suffering and personal discomfort even after the war had ended. But there was tremendous optimism as well. And oddly enough, as we're sitting here, I always remember my father talking about sitting round the radio, listening to the report of the Declaration of Independence in Israel. I mean, that was colossal for them, absolutely colossal, as a sense of hope for the future. So the British Empire was disintegrating, but all kinds of things were being born, and I don't see any of that now.
You don't think something is being born now that's just a different phase of history?
No idea what it is.
Okay, no idea what it is. Maybe we can bring it back to the personal for a minute, because I was really curious about the fact that you wrote a book whose protagonists are twins. Why twins?
I think very simply I wanted a brother and a sister, and twins are very interesting. You know, they're just interesting to write about. So I don't know any twins. No, I mean, I do know twins, but I don't have any twins in my family. It also made it easier for them to be the same age on a practical level. So there's nothing more to it than that.
But then how did you sort of find out, how did you research the relationship between twins? Because I do know some twins, and they really have a special kind of bond. You just sort of picked that up instinctively?
Well, I do know non-identical twins. They're the children of friends of mine, and I've known them since they were sort of about 8, 9, 10 years old, and they're now in their mid-30s. And they're brother and sister as well. And I always remember their mother saying, she knows what he's thinking. They know what each other are thinking.
And you have moments like that in the book, too, where each one knows. I don't want to point out one of them because it might not be suitable for mixed company.
Before we wrap up, maybe the obvious question, what's your next project?
Well, I'm very, very far along in it, and it's a novel set in London now in the time of Brexit. And it's a novel which is about home. It's about ideas of home. Where is your home? Where do you belong? What do you think of as home? And it's moving into the future, but it's moving faster than the future is being moved into now, if you see what I mean. So it's sort of really envisaging a time when Brexit has accelerated and the xenophobia and racism is really starting to take over.
Any Jewish characters?
Yes, but interestingly enough, and this is based on people I know, my nephew is married to an Iranian-Canadian girl, and so this is an Iranian-Jewish family, which is kind of, it's interesting to me to look at. I'd been to Iran, and I thought I would, maybe leave the Ashkenazis alone for that book.
I want to go back to something that you picked up on before when you said you don't know what's being born now. Mm-hmm. When you write a book about what's going on now and even speeding up the future, is there a sense in which, as a writer, you maybe do know what's being born, but you haven't consciously formulated it yourself, but it plays out in your creative process?
It's very, very difficult because, it's as if I lived in Tel Aviv. Here on this street, I live in a bubble, right? The block of this street had 16 Remain posters in the window. That building opposite was just plastered with Remain posters. We voted 80% Remain.
Who are those 20%?
Yeah, who are those 20%? I don't know who they are. Well, some of them voted Brexit. They voted Lexit, which is left exit, because they think, socialism in one country. And it's very difficult because all the people that I know are still hoping that it won't happen or that it would happen in some modified way. And because the Tory party, because the government is in such total disarray and actually has no idea how to implement it, just doesn't know how to do it, as we know with the Northern Ireland border, it's very, very difficult to predict what's going to happen. I mean, I can't say what's going to happen. And like everybody else, I'm reading. And I read all the analysis and nobody knows. Nobody knows what's going to happen. I do know that there has been an increase in racism, far fewer foreign students wanting to apply here. That was on the news this morning. And the reason for that is they are made not to feel welcome. I've seen these incidents on the streets with people saying, "Why haven't you gone home?"
Aren't you afraid in your new novel that you're going to be gazumped by the events?
Yes,
and,
of
and it will
course.
end up being this scary, counterfactual...
Yeah. I mean, that was always a problem at the beginning, so you have to be fairly nuanced and subtle about it. I will have to leave it open-ended, let's put it that way.
But it sounds like your novel is not so much a prediction of what's going to happen politically, so much as what happens in human nature and society.
That's right. I'm focusing on a group of individuals who are passing through this city in their own various bubbles, not paying very much attention to politics, just sort of living with the situation as it continues, as it goes on, and finding that their lives are unexpectedly affected by it.
Well, that sounds like a great prescription for all of us, not paying too much attention for politics. That's Linda Grant talking about her latest and 7th novel, The Dark Circle, from 2017. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Also, a big thanks to Gizem Özdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. We would also like to thank Peter Frey and Carrie Shapiro and the Romay Foundation, who made a very generous contribution to the Tel Aviv Review. You too can help us survive by contributing on our Patreon site. Chip in even small amounts, and you can choose from a range of fabulous gifts. Just go to our website, www.telavivreview.org, and click Donate. You'll also be part of our quest for depth, truth, and learning. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our archive on www.tlv1.fm/podcasts. There are almost 400 interviews to keep you busy and hopefully a little bit annoyed and interested. Like us on Facebook, the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. Follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.